Welcome to Curator's Chronicles, where the past takes flight and stories soar. I'm your host and curator, Christian Gurling, and today we have a truly remarkable episode for you. Our guest today is retired Air Force Colonel Scott Crogg. On September the 11th, 2001, Scott was serving as the Director of Operations for the Texas Air National Guard's 111th Attack Squadron, based out of Houston, Texas. In the wake of that fateful morning, Colonel Crogg was tasked with a mission of unparalleled importance, escorting Air Force One as it carried the President of the United States amidst the chaos and uncertainty that enveloped our nation. Join us as Colonel Scott Crogg shares his incredible first-hand account of that day, providing a unique and deeply personal perspective on one of the most significant events in modern history. From the initial moments of realization to the execution of his critical mission, his story is one of bravery, precision, and dedication to duty. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be captivated by this extraordinary tale as we delve into the events of September the 11th, 2001, and the vital role that Colonel Crogg played in protecting the leader of our nation. Colonel, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
So, every compelling story starts with a beginning. So, let's start with your beginning. So, if you would, how did you become involved in aviation, and where did this interest come from?
So I was a middle-class kid in high school in Palos Verdes, California, Southern California. You might be thinking middle class, that's not a middle class area. Well, it used to be, okay? In the 70s, that was a very middle class area. And I was just going to high school as a dishwasher. And then I started selling insurance for a family friend at State Farm, 17 years old. And he was just a great mentor for me. My father was in Orange County at the time, and just a great mentor. And one Christmas, he gave me a $500 gift certificate for flying lessons while I was working for him. And he'd give me every Wednesday afternoon after school. I'd normally go to work for him. He'd let me go to Torrance Airport, which is now Zamperini Field, to go and do a flying lesson. So, this is kind of one of those little known facts that if you see some occupation or someone in your life that you would like to emulate, you should copy them.
Sure.
And as a middle-class kid, some of the richest people in the neighborhood were a couple of airline pilots. So I just decided what's a good way to do this and make a living out of it. And I just kept following up with that, applied for the Air Force Academy, and by the grace of God, got in, and that started everything.
Wow. What was it? Was there anything about flying in particular that seemed to capture your imagination, or it was this is a good way to make a living?
I'll be honest with you. If I didn't think it was a good way to make a living and would impress the girls, I might not have got into it, because I was always planning on being a doctor. But once you start flying, and especially once you get down the road into your career and you're into something like an F-16, you can't imagine having ever made another choice.
Sure. No, so as you mentioned the Air Force Academy, which is, of course, quite prestigious. That Air Force Academy, of course, is based in Colorado. Explain to us how one gets into the school and how you made your way in there.
Well, you have to start off with applying to get a nomination. And a nomination is something that every congressman and congresswoman have two nominations to give to the Air Force Academy. So that's, 535 times 2. That's 1,070 nominations. Every senator has two. There's some presidential and vice presidential and some other ways you can get nominated. And that just gets your foot in the door to the Air Force Academy to look at your records and say, okay, we're going to appoint this person, and then accept, a class of 600 to 900, depending on recruitment sizes that year. So I applied to Representative Dan Lundgren. I don't know if that name sounds familiar at all. And he ended up being an attorney general for the state of California, but he was a representative for Long Beach, the county in Long Beach, which is right next to Palos Verdes. Applied with him. He invited me down for an interview. Very professional, 7 people at a table, which is pretty daunting for a high school boy. But I went and sat there, and I knew I had a good chance when one of the guys near the head of the table said, "Oh, you're selling insurance? Who are you working for?" I said, "Well, I'm working for Ed Pierce over in Torrance." He goes, "Oh, I know Ed." And, it's a good feeling when you're in a high-pressure situation like that. You suddenly have that familiarity.
Sure.
So, anyway, I got nominated by them. Then you got to go take a physical and a fitness test. And then you get on a plane and go get your haircut and start your career at the Air Force Academy.
Uh-huh. And what was life like there at the academy?
It's pretty tough those first couple of years. You kind of go from being a popular, successful kid to just being, by intent, you're just one of the crowd. You got the haircut, you got the really heavy course load, mandatory athletics, a long, cold Colorado winter. That first year, you're intentionally a second-class citizen. That's how the military gets us all bonded. And it can be kind of hard, but I will say the relationships I've made there and the friendships I've made there and the education I got there and the opportunity it gave me to go fly airplanes in the Air Force was absolutely amazing. So
second to none, sure.
It was good.
Now, you graduated in 1989, so tell us what happened after that.
So I graduated from 1989. We all get assigned a next assignment based on our career path. Some might be going to the military police, some might be going to be engineers, some might be going into systems acquisition, but a good chunk of us, maybe 50%, are going to pilot training. So I was assigned to go to Williams Air Force Base, which is in Chandler, Arizona. It's now Williams Skyport. It's been closed like a lot of bases. And I had a start date in October of '89. So I showed up down there. I reported in. They put me to some menial job for a few months and then started pilot training down in Phoenix.
And what aircraft did you train in initially?
So back then it was 6 months in a T-37, a little twin-engine Cessna jet, and then T-38, the Northrop Grumman. Looks a lot like an F-5, but it's a little less power and no weapons. So so T-37, T-38, and somewhere in there they kind of decide who's qualified to fly fighters or not. And I graduated in October 90, which was class 9101 because the fiscal year turns over October 1st. So.
And so for that particular program there, what's the washout rate?
Probably, I think we washed out 45% in our class, maybe 40%. So, that's the thing that you're kind of getting at, I think, is that the winnowing process from getting nominated from your congressman, going to the academy where you lose another 30% maybe. Mm-hmm. Pilot training where you lose another 40%. And, the Air Force has a program, and I'm convinced most of those people could make it if they had a little more time. But the Air Force is really strict that you have to meet these performance standards and you have to do them on our timeline. You don't get extra flights. The Navy does it a little differently. So, and then out of that, we got 3 fighters in the 18 people or 20 people we eventually graduated. We got 3 fighters.
And so you ended up, after this, in the first Gulf War. Talk a little bit about that particular experience and what that was like.
I wasn't in the first Gulf War. Okay. I was in fighter lead-in training at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, the night we started the shock and awe, that whole deal. Now, in the following years, 92 through 99, I went to Iraq I went to Saudi Arabia a bunch of times and Bahrain to enforce the no-fly zone over Iraq. So I had a lot of trips there and was involved in a lot of that geopolitical thing that was happening over there, and but didn't get combat until 2005, 2000 actual combat. I was logging combat time every time we went over Iraq, but not seeing real combat operations on the ground until the 2000s.
But that was something, in enforcing a no-fly zone, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was, we were there at the time when those helicopters, those Blackhawks got shot down in northern Iraq. That wasn't our area of responsibility. Do you remember that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so that was a big deal. And it's interesting that we had just had the talk because they told us that helicopters were going to be flying in southern Iraq, and they were doing agricultural spraying, these Polish helicopters. And so we start talking about it. Everybody that does the no-fly zone, the F-15 crews, the F-16 crews, the F-18 crews, the F-18 Strike Eagle guys. And we're sitting in a room while Intel's briefing us on, here's what this helicopter is going to look like, here's how you can identify it. And we just looked around at each other, and I said, guys, is this even worth it to go down there and at 300 feet try to find this helicopter when it's just an agricultural asset? And is it even worth it? Can we even identify that thing? We all kind of looked around and said, you know what? We're not going to worry about those things. Mm-hmm. And then they had that issue in the north. And I wish we'd sent our notes up to the north side or northern Iraq for Northern Watch. I was part of Southern Watch, just to ensure that they had that talk too. But anyway, sometimes some of the ideas get handled at the lowest level and don't come down to the leadership, and that's just what happens.
Did you have any incidents when you were patrolling the no-fly zone?
We would see airplanes up at an airfield that was just north of the line they weren't supposed to cross. And every once in a while, they'd stumble across the line. But once you've been there a few times, the lawyer in the back of your head would say, don't do anything stupid.
Sure.
And make sure any wreckage, if there is wreckage, has to fall on our side of the line. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't want to take a shot over the line or have them come over the line and then turn around while your missile's in flight, and then they drag it back over the line. You just have to be real smart and not have your fangs out, not be aggressive, just do your job. Mm-hmm. And so I would say no, other than seeing people out there, not much during the no-fly zone, but, saw and did a lot later when we went back.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward a little bit, a few years to September the 11th, 2001. At this point, you're the director of operations for the 11th Fighter Squadron at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base in Houston, Texas, and have just arrived home from a 24-hour shift. Now, walk us through that morning, if you would, please.
Okay, I'll just say it was the 111th Fighter Squadron. I got to stand up for my old squadron, So I got home. I've been on a 24-hour shift sitting alert. And for those that don't know, we have 2 ships of fighters sitting alert at various spots around the United States. So it's not like we're unprotected at any given time. It's probably less spots than you think, but it's enough for now, considering the radar coverage we have. So get up at 7. That's when we do the swap out. You don't always sleep well on alert because there's 4 of us in a little cinder block hallway. And if somebody's snoring or making noise, you might not all sleep that well. No big deal. Had a handover briefing with the incoming crew. You're always going to have 2 airplanes on 15-minute alert, which means you can be airborne in 15 minutes max. It's usually closer to 11. And then I went home. And if I recall correctly, I think I saw the first building burning on TV, and someone made a comment that it was they think a small aircraft had hit one of the buildings. So anyway, I drive home, 10-minute drive, crawl into bed. I'm just going to take a little nap. And as I'm trying to doze off, I see the second airplane fly into the tower. And I think we all had that realization, those of us that were watching TV, when we saw that second airplane go in. Okay, this is the real deal. This isn't an accident. This isn't a joke. This is the real deal, and that was a big airplane. That wasn't a Cessna that flew into that building. So as the operations officer, I went right back to work, and a little tired, but I was rested enough. We walked in, and as soon as I walked in, I'd been thinking about this on the drive up. I found the first guy I saw, who's a good friend of mine, and Major Shane Brotherton. His call sign was Bear. I said, Bear, let's go. We got to go get 2 airplanes ready. So the goal is to go out to these airplanes, run them for 8 minutes so that the inertial navigation system can cook up, We didn't have GPS in the airplane at that time. And, well, we might have had GPS by then, but if you cook up the INS, then when you come back to the plane, it only takes a minute and a half to cook up the second time. It's called hot cocking the airplane. So we went out and put our gear at the airplanes. I told maintenance to heat up the guns because these were just training airplanes. 2 airplanes were already airborne. Our 2 alert, the guys that had taken over from me on alert had already got airborne. So I just said, let's get 2 more jets ready to go. And we sat and waited and walked back to the command post, which is a secure area where they have all the screens and the classified computer systems. So they're getting all the latest messages from air traffic control and NORAD and SEADS, which is the Southeast Air Defense Sector. That's who controls our airplanes most of the time. And then we got another scramble order. So we still, at this point, I still didn't know what our first 2 airplanes were doing, who they were escorting, I didn't even know they were escorting. I just knew they'd gotten airborne. And, they really left it up to those pilots and then us to get airborne and start figuring out what's going on. That's about it. I'll let you jump in if you want.
Sure. And I will point out, I believe you were a commercial pilot at the time as well, weren't you?
Yes, I got hired by Delta in 1999,
and
December 99.
So at this point, you had known that commercial aircraft had flown into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. That must have been particularly devastating for you, being a commercial pilot and knowing that commercial aircraft had crashed into the towers.
Yeah, it gave me a little insight, too, to what our job might be that day and what would be required. And as a pilot, what radios I would need to be on to communicate with the pilots, what their considerations would be to be able to follow directions and go where we need them to go. Or if we have to shoot someone down, just thinking about where the key nodes in the airplane are and, what we would have to do. So, I had it from both sides. And I still to this day fly for Delta. I go to Europe a lot. And I fly with these guys. And it's interesting to hear their stories from 9/11 and where they went. Because they all got immediately told to land wherever you are. All the European airplanes were coming back and landing at Halifax and Goose Bay and Bangor and, all these places in the Northeast. And everybody else was landing at the nearest airfield they could because the FAA ordered an immediate ground stop.
Yeah. And when you were on base, you called your mother and your fiancé at the time from the base. What did you tell them?
Well, so these were the flip phone days,
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure my mom called me, and I just told her I'm okay. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing today. I might not be able to talk, but I'm okay, and I'll be okay. And then I told my fiancé the same thing. It was just that was hard for them. God bless them for, being part of that team that my military career has been. And because they just had to suck it up. Everybody wanted to talk to somebody and be with somebody that day. It was just so traumatizing. And all I could say was, I've landed at another base. I'm still fine. I won't be home tonight, blah, blah, blah. So it was interesting.
So you ended up, you get in your F-16 and you're launched. And where are you going at this point? What areas are you in charge of patrol?
We were a 2-ship. Cowrie 2-1 was the call sign. And we got airborne. 2 were already airborne, and they just gave us a direction. And then they told us to go to Barksdale Air Force Base. So we have no idea how long we're going to be airborne, if there's tankers for us, if we're just going to patrol. We would call it a CAP, Combat Air Patrol. And yes, it was very bizarre because we had done that combat air patrol. That's what you do when you're patrolling a no-fly zone.
Yeah.
You get up there, you set up a racetrack, you preserve gas, you look at your radar, you listen to the radios, and see what you can see, report back. And now we're doing that over Louisiana. And every other airplane had already landed at that point. So there was no other commercial traffic. It was just military with a very occasional somebody who hadn't got the word and was being directed to land. And so we're up there in the mid 20,000s, 25,000 feet over the field at Barksdale, and they still haven't told us exactly what we're doing. But I do see Air Force One, light blue, baby blue, powder blue Air Force One down there at the field. So I start figuring things out.
Mm-hmm.
The first two ships that had gotten airborne, one of them stayed airborne to do the combat air patrol over the airfield, and the other one landed with Air Force One to get gas, so they'd be available to go with them the next spot. So we saw Air Force One getting airborne. I rolled the other guy into my 2-ship so that we were now a 3-ship. And the airplane that had been patrolling when we got there now had to go back to Houston he was going to be out of gas. So he's going back to Houston. So we're a 3-ship now, heading northbound with Air Force One.
So are you told by anyone where you were going?
We had an initial message, and then we were given a frequency for the AWACS. There was an AWACS airborne.
Okay.
And as soon as we started heading north, I told the AWACS, "Is there a tanker for us?" And he kind of, this is the thing. Everybody was caught so off guard. I don't want to say that people sounded like they weren't prepared for this. It's kind of part of our secret sauce as an American fighting force, that even when we're not prepared, we still know what to do and who to talk to, and we get it done. It's really our biggest advantage in the combat aviation and the ground combat too. But he hadn't thought of that one. Well, he may have. I shouldn't say that. But he didn't have anybody airborne at that time. So I knew, look, if we're going to take Air Force One, you got to tell me where we're going, or you got to give me gas. You can't do both. You can't not tell me and not give me gas. Mm-hmm. So a tanker did join on us. We kind of have some rules about how close to fly to a high-value asset like Air Force One. You don't fly on their wingtips. You give them a few miles, and you just to be ultra safe and have the ability to look around all over the place without worry of getting close to them or, having any kind of incident. And we got gas. We do that at 23,000 feet, 300 knots, 310 knots. It's the normal speed. And, nobody ever told me how fast a 747 could be when they wanted to. And that thing was hauling ass. I mean, it was going close to 0.9 Mach, which is fine. We can do that, but we use a lot more gas at 0.9 Mach. We had 2 tanks on. Anyway, we had some stuff on the airplane. So we're just heading north. Now at least we got gas. They still won't tell me where they're going, but when I hooked up to the tanker, we have an interphone system where you can now "Hey, how you doing today? Oh man, what a crazy day. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is crazy. We're just talking about just how insane 9/11 was, how unexpected. So we're just having a little conversation, probably some off-color language going on too. And I said, all right, man, I need every TACAN channel, which is navigational aid. I need every TACAN channel between here and the Canadian border because I want to start tracking other bases and be prepared to turn toward them and get there. So he gives me all the TACAN channels. I write them down, and we get our gas, and they peel off. And I'm pretty sure they were going to stay airborne in case we needed more. But as soon as we finished getting our gas, full load, 2 tanks, 12,500 pounds of gas, which is a lot for an F-16. Air Force One starts descending. I'm like, oh my God, we just got all this gas. You don't usually land with a full load of gas,
right, Right.
And oh my God. So Air Force One's descending. I start kind of doing the math, checking my TACAN channels. There's this base, there's McConnell, we're going to Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. So we kind of figure that out, and me and my wingman are talking on the radio I think we're going to Offutt, and we had those off-color conversations too about, man, this is effed up. This is really something. But then you get snapped back into the moment and start focusing on your job again. And so we descend. I get down to over Lincoln, Nebraska, and we're just too heavy to land. There's a big crosswind, and I don't want to put these airplanes on a runway with still 10,000 pounds of gas and I have a problem with the tires, and we need to be ready to go when Air Force One's ready to go. So I asked the controller at Lincoln Approach, hey, sir, this is Cowrie 2-1. We need to do afterburner 360 at 6,000 feet. Is that okay? Yeah, Cowrie 2-1. Go ahead. That's approved. And so we're doing these, 8 to 9G, afterburner turns at 6,000 feet, just trying to burn enough gas down to land comfortably. And that's painful for those of the viewers or listeners, the readers that don't know. Pulling 9Gs for anything more than 10 or 15 seconds is just painful. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we did it as quick as we could, panting, and then we landed and went into base operations at Offutt Air Force Base.
When you were up in the air, how many F-16s and or other aircraft were escorting Air Force One?
Only us three,
okay.
And it was kind of ironic. We got into base operations. We didn't have any maps, approach charts, publications for any other airfields other than Louisiana and Texas. You don't carry a big box of pubs with you every time you go fly. You only carry pubs for the area you're going to be in. And now we're over all this, land that we don't have any approaches for, any maps for. And, you remember this, one of the positive things about 9/11 is it was probably one of the most beautiful days over 75% of the country. I got to see it all that day. And it was just spotless. The sky was just spotless. The sun was, beautiful. So I didn't really need approach charts, but as soon as we got into base operations at Offutt, every base has this. They've got a table with all these for mission planning, and they have all these stacks of charts and approach charts, and they all have written in big red letters, "Do not remove from base operations." And, you always respect that, and we just looked around and said, we're taking all these suckers. So we took all the charts, sat down, started talking about what we were doing. And you want me to continue about what was going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. This is
okay.
Great.
So we're sitting there and talking and eating some chips and drinking a Diet Coke. And Colonel Tillman walks in, Colonel Mark Tillman, the commander of Air Force One. He says, "You guys Cowrie?" And, he could see our 3 F-16s out on the ramp. I said, "Yes, sir." He goes, "Let's go brief." And we go upstairs to a room. It wasn't technically a secure room, but it's good enough. He said, "Okay, here's the deal." We swapped phone numbers on our little flip phones. He said, "The president wants you to continue with us to Andrews. He's an alumni of your unit. I don't know if you knew this, but Bush was an alumni of the 111 Fighter Squadron in Houston at Ellington Field. And he's glad to have you guys aboard. He doesn't want anybody else he doesn't know now joining on the airplane or joining on Air Force One. And we'd like you to continue with us, okay?
Yeah.
Sir, if you please do me the favor of just give me a call when you guys get ready to go so we can be ready to go with you." "Yeah, no problem. And so we sat there for probably an hour, and all of a sudden we hear some engines start out on the ramp. Oh, no. And Air Force One is starting up, and we're still sitting on our butts eating chips, So we run outside, get in the airplanes, get them going as quickly as we can, and they're all gassed up, and we got all that taken care of. But by the time we get, brakes released and rolling out of our taxi spots, Air Force One's taken off. They just said, screw it. So I just kind of scratched my head. So, well, obviously they got more information and more pressing duties than waiting for us. So we got out there as quick as we could. We got airborne, and we were, at that point, maybe 50 miles behind them. But at least now we could talk on the radio a little bit because they trusted us and figured that out. And they did a couple of S-turns in order to let us catch up. And now we were going to escort them all the way to D.C. So we did get airborne with them and took them all the way to D.C.
So all commercial aircraft had landed at this point. Is that correct?
Yes. There's nobody else.
So you weren't necessarily concerned about any other commercial aircraft being in the area and being a threat to Air Force One?
There was one point when AWACS started talking about someone airborne over Tennessee. I wasn't really worried about other commercial aircraft, but you really had no idea what else might be out there. You just had to listen to what the air traffic control chatter was, and make a decision based on that. But when they started talking about this low-flying aircraft over Tennessee, we were also going by Ohio at that point, and there was a couple of airplanes airborne from the Springfield, Ohio National Guard unit, and we made sure they would go look at this person and then go back to their combat air patrol so that we could continue with Air Force One.
Was there any discussion earlier on about if there's any commercial aircraft in the area and become a threat to the U.S., a threat to Air Force One, what you are supposed to do?
Yeah, I got clarification before we ever left on who was going to have authority for shoot down. And they said Southeast Air Defense Sector would. And then when we were airborne, I asked again, I said, if we can't get that from you, do we have authority? And they said yes. Now, we only had a 20 millimeter gun with us, which is a great weapon, but it's not ideal for taking out an aircraft. Mm-hmm. You know, and I don't mean to talk about this so matter of factly, but you know, this is the job. So,
right.
So it could certainly be done with the gun, but we had to think about that. And even with the missiles, you know, all of our books, our classified books, say one missile really isn't enough to take down an airliner. You can't count on that enough to call that good. So anyway, we only had the gun anyway. But we talked about it, and you know, we talked about it before we ever got airborne. We talked about it again at Offutt. Just that you know, we're gonna wait till the latest possible moment to make that decision. We're gonna do our best to get full approval on the radio, so everybody knows we're all on the same page. We've done everything we can. This airplane is executing all of the suspect tendencies, or said explicitly that they're, you know, not American, and we're just gonna have to wait long enough. But I don't want to wait so long that the wreckage falls into a city, you know. So we just had to. There was a lot to think about, but you know, thank God we didn't have to do it.
Wow. As you're coming into the Washington D.C. area and Andrews Air Force Base, are you seeing any other military aircraft besides a couple others?
So this is a kind of a funny story because we are a trained, assigned alert, air defense alert unit. Like, that's our bread and butter. So we know all the ins and outs. And so we know you don't get that close to Air Force One. So I briefed it that one guy was going to go fly up the airfield, do an overhead pattern way out in front of Air Force One, and then two of us would be back way behind it and land after Air Force One. And so we're doing all this. Beautiful. It's just before sunset. We're going to complete getting this package to D.C. And all of a sudden, the Washington, D.C. Guard join up right to the wings of Air Force One. It's not their primary mission to know that they shouldn't do that. But I will say, I am sure the country felt a lot better when they looked out those windows, looked at TV, and saw those shots out of the windows of Air Force One of those F-16s on the wingtips. So I forgive them for any breach in protocol.
Yeah, and you're coming into Washington D.C. and you're flying by the Pentagon and you see this hole in the side made from American Airlines Flight 77. Describe that and what that was like, seeing that and the realization that even though you knew America was under attack, it must have. I guess it really must have like, hey, this is real now.
Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up the chronology because I didn't see the Pentagon until the following morning.
Okay, sure.
So we landed at Andrews, and we waited at the end of the runway in the hammerhead down there, and the sun was below the horizon. It was really dusk. It was getting dark, and we watched Air Force One kind of from a distance, about half the airfield away. That entourage and the president came down the steps, and they got into Marine 1 and Marine 2, the helicopters. Mm-hmm. And they took off, they got airborne, and they flew, basically right by us there at the end of the runway, waved at us, and that was it. So we taxied into the DC Guard ramp, and a guy I know pretty well was there, Raven Kane. He ended up being a general working with the special ops in Syria and Iraq later, and great guy. And he says, I said, all right, Raisin, do you need us to stay here tonight and help you with the caps tomorrow? Because he knew D.C. was going to need a lot of airplanes, being a high threat the day after 9/11. And he said, no, we got it. So we went to the hotel, and by the time we got to the hotel, the president was sitting at his desk delivering that post-attack announcements. So we get up the next morning, we get out to the airplanes, had a whole night to think about everything. Everything was just so quiet, you know. We were all in such a state of shock. The whole country was in a state of shock. We got out to the airplanes, we got airborne. There's nobody else airborne. I mean, this is the first time I've ever flown in my life where I only talked to 3 or 4 people, whatever it was. Washington, D.C. Center, Atlanta Center, Houston Center, maybe Fort Worth Center in the middle, Houston Approach, Ellington Field, Ellington Ground.
That must have been really surreal.
Very surreal. And then as we took off out of D.C., there was the Pentagon, and that really made you think. I will say, though, I felt a little bit better seeing it from the air and how small that hole was compared to the size of the Pentagon. Like, I imagined that one whole side was gone, you know. And just thinking, you know what, those guys weren't even close to taking out that building. I at least took a little solace in that. And then we got back to Ellington and got on with our lives.
Mm-hmm. Could you, when you went by the Pentagon, of course it's, you know, still on fire and smoking, could you smell all that still? So
no, I couldn't smell it, but we could see the smoke. That was it was the fires were out, I'm pretty sure, but you could see the smoke. It was still a smoking hole.
Do you think, you know, looking back and on your experience on 9/11, do you think that changed you as a person?
You know, it gave me resolve. I was always very patriotic. It's just the way I was raised, this Italian immigrant family. And, you know, you get a lot from your parents in the neighborhood you grow up in. And this was just, Palos Verdes was a very working class, conservative, not to overgeneralize, but, you know, I also grew up in an era, you may have too, where our schools did a little programming, you know, like standing up and saying the national anthem and saying the Pledge of Allegiance and all those things. We got a little program to really love our country.
Right.
And I'm not sure they do all that stuff anymore, but I think it's healthy for a country if you want it to be an ongoing concern. And so I was always really patriotic. And after 9/11, I knew everything was going to change in my military life, and I knew everything was going to change for my commercial aircraft life, because the commercial aircraft world was going to go to crap. I mean, that was obvious for a few years. And the military was going to be open for business, you know. So I got furloughed a little bit after that, and I had a full-time job waiting for me with the military. There was plenty of money for full-time orders, and you know, it was just going to be an adventure. I just knew everything had changed. I ended up doing these kind of, all my military deployments. You're just so proud to be with these great human beings. There's accountability in the military. If people don't pull their weight, they either change or they're gone. You just end up with this really great core group of people. And by that time, I'm in the Guard and then the Reserves. And the active duty has already done all the filtering for you in the Guard and Reserves usually, because you're just hiring people that are coming out of the active duty. Mm-hmm. So you just end up with this great group of people, great attitudes. You know, I like to say people that take out the trash. Like if you're sitting in a room and there's a full trash can, I just don't want us walking by that trash can 8 times. Somebody take it out. It's just a showing that you care about this whole operation, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of already in that mindset, ready to do all that stuff. But certainly all the combat times, I ended up going to 2+ month deployments, 3-month deployments, 3-month deployments in Iraq on the ground at Balad Air Base, which is 40 miles north of Baghdad. And those were really life changing, because that's when you're there working with the ground guys, doing real combat scenarios, helping the troops on the ground, looking for IEDs on roads, overseeing raids, just doing amazing things. The things you always talked about doing, the things you always trained to do, making life and death decisions. I mean, all those things that really, you know it when you're doing it, and you never forget it.
No, and you've had quite a fulfilling career and with 9/11, you talked about a lot of the changes that happened both in the world of commercial aviation and in the military world. What were some of those changes that you saw immediately, and how they were affected by 9/11?
So one of my very first flights, I was an engineer on a 727, which means I sat behind the pilots, facing sideways, looking at a panel full of knobs and gauges and dials. I'm supposed to be the one balancing the fuel and making sure the generators come online. It's my very first job with Delta Airlines, probably year 2000. And I'm sitting up there, the doors open the whole flight.
Yeah.
These cute flight attendants are walking in and out, saying hi, do you need any coffee? And this cute flight attendant comes in and sits on my lap. I was single at the time, and with a hot fudge sundae.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right before 9/11. It was probably the highlight of my Delta career. Because after that, the doors got closed, the security became heinous. I mean, you know what it's like going to the airport these days. We got to do it all the time, and you'd think they'd be easier on us, and they are a little bit, but it's still just a hell of a way to go to work every day.
Is
and
it
the military,
being a commercial pilot after 9/11, you're continuing to fly. Is that always kind of in the back of your mind, like, hey, something like this could happen again? I need to remain vigilant, and
you had to be careful. You had to compartmentalize what was going on, because realistically, you had to think to yourself, they've done this one. They're probably not going to do this one again. It's just going to be a lot harder, because they went beyond the length of our imagination. That's how they did 9/11. No one imagined they would do something like this. Mm-hmm. You couldn't have locked down airports on 9/10. You couldn't have done it. Nobody would have believed you. No one would have stood for it. You just couldn't have done it. Mm-hmm. And then after 9/11, everything got changed. And but there would be things where, I read this story the other day where this person was a mathematician and was doing calculus and differential equations on a piece of paper, and someone told the flight attendant, "I'm worried about this person. They're writing in some strange language." That's what it was like after 9/11, where people were suspect of other people a little bit, more so the passengers. We started a flight deck officer program where pilots could go to training and carry weapons in the cockpit. And so we had air marshals for a long time, not on every flight, but on enough of them. And so that changed too. There's just a lot more security. It wouldn't have been the place for a terrorist to exploit after that, I don't think. I mean, not that they couldn't, but not the first choice, I don't think.
Right. And I know there was different regulations, and as I understand it, you were even allowed to bring knives if they were less than 4 inches in length on an airplane prior to 9/11.
Yeah, probably something like that. Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I remember being driven straight to the airplane. If you were in Montana or somewhere and you had to fly the next morning, you didn't go through any security. You went straight to the airplane and walked up the stairs and went in the airplane before 9/11. Mm-hmm. So I went out from Delta on military leave, full-time military, from 2006 to 2013. So Delta was kind enough to let me go. They're required by law to let us go 5 years. They let me go 7. And that's when I did those trips to Iraq. And then after the F-16, I went to the F-22. So I got to do some great things out on those 7 years when I thought I was already done with the military, Wow.
Well, we appreciate your service, and that's really, your story is really something about September the 11th.
It's been a privilege, Christian. It's been a privilege.